Marianne Reynolds stared at the handwritten note on her kitchen counter, her coffee growing cold beside it. The morning sun streamed through the penthouse windows, highlighting specks of dust in the air, ordinary particles that seemed to mock the extraordinary moment unfolding in her designer kitchen. "I can't do this anymore. Don't try to find me. I'm sorry." Her husband's precise handwriting, always so controlled, showed subtle signs of hesitation, a slight tremor in the Y, an ink blot where he'd paused too long. Marianne knew Alexander's handwriting like she knew his face, having seen it on countless contracts and anniversary cards over their 15 years together. The Wall Street Journal lay unopened on the counter. Reynolds Enterprises post-record Q3 earnings. She pushed it aside, her silk robe catching on the granite edge. Just yesterday, they'd hosted the annual charity gala at the Royal York. Alexander had been his usual self-charming Toronto's elite, his hand resting possessively on her back as they worked the room. She'd noticed nothing unusual, except perhaps that he'd had 3 scotches instead of his usual 2. Moving through their penthouse felt like navigating a museum after hours, everything familiar yet somehow wrong. In their bedroom, the walk-in closet told the story her mind refused to accept. Alexander's suits, arranged by color and season, were gone. The vintage watch collection he'd spent decades building had vanished from its custom display case, leaving perfectly shaped indentations in the velvet. The next 4 hours dissolved into a blur of increasingly desperate phone calls. Their joint accounts had been emptied, not cleaned out, but professionally liquidated with all the proper paperwork filed. His office at Reynolds Enterprises was locked, his assistant Jennifer stammering through obvious lies about meetings and business trips. "Mrs. Reynolds," the police detective said, his tone carefully neutral, "your husband appears to have left voluntarily, without evidence of foul play." She hung up before he could finish. By evening, her phone buzzed constantly with calls from board members, shareholders, and journalists. The business channels ran endless speculation about Reynolds Enterprises' future without its CEO. Marianne sat in their living room, her living room now, watching Toronto's skyline fade into dusk, each twinkling light representing another life continuing normally while hers imploded. The company they'd built from a small consulting firm into a telecommunications giant now teetered on the edge of chaos. Board members demanded emergency meetings. Shareholders threatened lawsuits. The dream they'd shared was crumbling, and Marianne was left alone to watch it fall. Vancouver's perpetual drizzle matched Marianne's mood as she reviewed acquisition papers in her office at the Vancouver Art Gallery. 4 years had passed since that morning in Toronto, and she'd learned to find comfort in the gray skies that seemed to validate her lingering grief. The yellowed newspaper clipping pinned to her bulletin board read, "Reynolds Enterprises acquired by Global Communications Corp." She kept it visible, not as self-punishment, but as a reminder of survival. The company's collapse had been swift and clinical, like a corporate euthanasia. "Ms. Reynolds?" Sarah, her assistant, appeared in the doorway. "The Morrison collection just arrived. They need your sign-off on placement." Marianne nodded, grateful for the interruption. At 45, she'd rebuilt herself from scratch, trading boardroom politics for curators' previews. Her designer wardrobe had given way to artistic, comfortable pieces, and she'd stopped fighting the silver strands in her hair. The gallery's storage area hummed with activity as workers carefully unpacked the new acquisitions. Marianne moved among them with quiet authority, her trained eye evaluating each piece's condition. This was her world now, far removed from profit margins and shareholder meetings. "The lighting needs to be adjusted for the Hendrix piece," she instructed, watching the workers position a large canvas. "The afternoon sun will wash out the undertones otherwise." Her voice carried the confidence of someone who had found their true calling, even if by accident. Later, walking the 3 blocks to her Yaletown apartment, Marianne allowed herself to think about Alexander. The first year after his disappearance had been a maze of lawyers, creditors, and reporters spinning tales of embezzlement and scandal. Nothing was ever proven, but the questions lingered like smoke under closed doors. Her apartment, though modest, felt more like home than the Toronto penthouse ever had. Plants crowded the windows, and her own paintings, begun in therapy, continued from genuine interest, lined the walls. Each piece represented a step away from the woman she'd been, the wife of Alexander Reynolds. The landline rang, her mother's weekly call from Toronto. Marianne had kept the landline specifically for these conversations, a small concession to her past. Richard Thompson mentioned seeing Alexander in Chicago, her mother said carefully. At least he thinks it was Alexander. Marianne's hand tightened on the phone. Mom, please, that's not my life anymore. But later, alone with her thoughts, she wondered, as she did more often than she admitted, what had really happened. The question hung in the air like the Vancouver rain, persistent and impossible to ignore. Alexander Reynolds stood at his office window, Manhattan's skyline glittering beyond the glass. At 68, he'd become what the Financial Times called Wall Street's ghost, a reclusive figure managing billions through layers of proxies and attorneys. His reflection showed the price of his choices: silver hair kept meticulously trimmed, designer glasses masking perpetual exhaustion, deep lines etched around his mouth from years of forced silence. The Tom Ford cologne he still wore was his only concession to his past life. The intercom buzzed. Mr. Reynolds, your car is ready. Thank you, James. His voice was rough from disuse. Le Bernardin had been his Thursday ritual for years. Same table, same wine, same carefully orchestrated solitude. The staff knew better than to attempt conversation beyond necessary pleasantries. His driver, Marcus, held the door of the Bentley without speaking, understanding his employer's preference for silence. As the car navigated Manhattan's evening traffic, Alexander checked his encrypted email. The weekly security report arrived on schedule. Subject maintains position as senior curator, Vancouver Art Gallery. No unusual activity noted. The maitre d' greeted him with practiced discretion, leading him to his corner table. Alexander adjusted his Patek Philippe watch, one of the few possessions he'd kept from his previous life. The restaurant hummed with conversation, none directed at the notorious recluse in their midst. His fingers traced the stem of his wine glass as he waited for his usual order. The truth he'd carried for 4 years sat heavy in his chest. The threats, the evidence of corruption that went higher than anyone suspected, the choice he'd made to protect Marianne by leaving. Tonight felt different somehow. The air seemed charged with possibility, as if the universe was holding its breath. He didn't know it yet, but his carefully constructed solitude was about to shatter like crystal on marble. Alexander's fork clattered against fine china as a familiar laugh cut through Le Bernardin's ambient noise. His hand trembled, sending droplets of red wine across pristine white tablecloth. That laugh. He hadn't heard it in 4 years, but his body remembered. Marianne sat at a table near the windows, city lights silhouetting her profile. She'd let her hair go naturally silver, and it suited her. Her clothes spoke of artistic sophistication rather than corporate power, but she carried herself with the same grace he remembered. It was her companion that made Alexander's blood run cold. The young man sitting across from her couldn't have been more than 30, but the resemblance was uncanny. He had Alexander's jawline, his characteristic way of gesturing, even the same habit of running fingers through his hair when concentrating. The similarity was impossible, yet... "More wine, sir." The sommelier's voice startled Alexander from his trance. "No." His throat felt like sandpaper. "The check." His hands shook as he reached for his water glass. Questions raced through his mind. Who was this young man? Could Marianne have been pregnant when he left? But no. His security team would have reported something that significant, wouldn't they? The young man... Elliot, he heard Marianne call him, leaned forward, engaging her in what appeared to be an intense discussion about art acquisitions. Their interaction suggested familiarity, but maintained a professional edge that didn't quite fit a mother-son dynamic. Alexander's carefully constructed world began to crack. The reasons for his departure, corrupt board members, money laundering evidence that implicated Toronto's financial elite, threats against Marianne, suddenly seemed hollow against this new mystery. Marianne glanced in his direction, a casual scan of the room that froze when their eyes met. He watched emotions parade across her face: shock, pain, anger, and something else. Determination, perhaps. Her fingers whitened around her napkin. Elliot, noticing her distress, turned to follow her gaze. Alexander looked away, but not before catching the young man's expression of recognition and... calculation? The maitre d' appeared with his check, providing a momentary shield. Alexander signed without looking at the amount, his mind racing. As he stood to leave, he heard Marianne's chair scrape against the floor. He quickened his pace, but her voice stopped him at the coat check. Alexander. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and turned. She stood 3 feet away, her expression controlled despite the slight tremor in her hands as they gripped her leather bag. Marianne, he managed, barely above a whisper. 4 years, she said, each word precise and cutting. And you just happened to be at Le Bernardin? Before he could respond, Elliot appeared at her side. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking, but there were differences too. Features that reminded Alexander of someone else, someone from long ago. Everything okay? Elliot asked, his tone protective yet professional. Marianne's laugh held no humor. Elliot, meet Alexander Reynolds, my husband, technically still my husband, since he disappeared before we could divorce. Recognition flickered across Elliot's face, but it wasn't the shock of meeting a stranger. It was the satisfaction of confirmation. I think, Marianne said, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion, that we have some things to discuss. Don't you, Alexander? The private dining room at Le Bernardin felt like an interrogation chamber. Alexander sat across from Marianne and Elliot, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on the white tablecloth. The waiter had just closed the door, leaving them in a silence heavy with unspoken accusations. You look well, Alexander offered weakly. Don't... Marianne's voice could have frozen champagne. I want to know why. Why now? Have you been watching me? Alexander's gaze flickered to Elliot, who studied him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. The young man's presence complicated everything he might have said. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Alexander suggested. No, both Marianne and Elliot said simultaneously, exchanging a look that spoke volumes. Elliot stays, Marianne insisted. He's more involved than you know. She paused, squaring her shoulders. He's been investigating Reynolds Enterprises' collapse. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. What? I'm a financial forensic investigator, Elliot explained, his tone clinically professional. Specializing in corporate fraud and organized crime, Mrs. Reynolds hired my firm 6 months ago. The irony wasn't lost on Alexander, that of all the investigators in New York, Marianne had chosen someone who could have been his younger twin. He wondered if she'd done it deliberately. What exactly are you investigating? Alexander asked, though dread told him he already knew. Marianne leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his face. 3 months ago, I received an anonymous package. Inside were documents dating back to 1990, internal memos, bank statements, and photographs suggesting massive fraud within Reynolds Enterprises. But not by you, Alexander. By the board members who threatened you. Alexander's hand froze around his water glass. How did you? Gerald Matthews, she said simply. Your former secretary? He kept copies of everything. He died last year but arranged for the documents to be sent to me posthumously. The name hit Alexander like a physical blow. Gerald had been the only one who knew the full truth, who had helped him arrange his disappearance when the threats became too dangerous to ignore. The board members, Alexander began, his voice hoarse. They weren't just embezzling. They were laundering money for some of the most dangerous people in Toronto. When I discovered their operation, they made it clear that if I exposed them, you would pay the price. Elliot pulled out a tablet, quickly accessing files. We found evidence linking them to organized crime syndicates. The money trail led through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, eventually connecting to several prominent families in Toronto's financial district. The Donovans, Alexander whispered. The Harrises, the Mackenzies. All dead now, Marianne added quietly. Convenient accidents over the years. The weight of 4 years of silence pressed down on Alexander's shoulders. I left to protect you, Marianne. They showed me photos, you at gallery openings, having lunch with friends, shopping. They knew every move you made. The threat was clear. Either I disappeared, or you would... Why didn't you tell me? Marianne's voice cracked slightly. We could have faced it together, gone to the authorities. The authorities were compromised, Alexander replied, running a tired hand over his face. The corruption went all the way up to the police commissioner. I couldn't risk your life. Leaving. It was the only way I could think to keep you safe. Elliot had been taking notes, his expression growing more concerned. Mr. Reynolds, the network you're describing, Some of it still exists. Different players, but the same structure. And they're aware of our investigation. The implication hung heavy in the air. Alexander felt the old fear rising. Not for himself this time, but for Marianne, and this young man who had unknowingly stepped into a decades-old web of corruption. Last week, Elliot continued, our firm's servers were hacked. Files were accessed, specifically the ones related to this case. He slid an envelope across the table. And Mrs. Reynolds received this. Inside was a single photograph. Marianne leaving her Vancouver apartment, taken 3 days ago. The message was clear. History was threatening to repeat itself. There's something else you need to know, Elliot said, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. The reason Mrs. Reynolds hired our firm specifically, it's because of me, because of who I am. Alexander and Marianne looked at him expectantly. Catherine Donovan was my mother, Elliot revealed quietly. Your former board member's daughter, Mr. Reynolds. She left me a letter explaining everything before she died. About the corruption, your disappearance, her father's role in it all. The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. Catherine, she tried to warn me, didn't she? Just before I left. Elliot nodded. She kept evidence, just like Gerald did. She wanted to make things right but never got the chance. The car accident that killed her. He left the implication hanging. Marianne moved closer to Elliot, her protective instinct evident. When he came to my office with Catherine's letter and his proposal to investigate, I knew we had to pursue it. Not just for us, Alexander, but for everyone they silenced. Alexander stood abruptly, moving to the window. Below, Manhattan continued its evening rhythm, oblivious to the decades of secrets unraveling in the room above. We need to move quickly, he said, turning back to face them. I have resources. People who've helped me stay hidden all these years. People who owe me favors. We're not running, Marianne stated firmly. Not this time. No, Alexander agreed, a plan forming in his mind. This time we fight back, but we do it smart. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts he'd hoped never to use. How much evidence do you have? Elliot opened his laptop, revealing folders of meticulously organized data. Enough to bring down half of Toronto's financial district. But we need more. Something current. Something they can't bury. Then we give them exactly what they fear most, Alexander said, his voice taking on the authority that had once commanded boardrooms. A reunion of the people they tried to silence. 2 weeks later, Alexander's Manhattan office had transformed into a war room. Evidence covered every surface, financial records, surveillance photos, and digital forensics spanning 4 decades. Marianne sat cross-legged on the leather sofa, her curator's precision now focused on organizing years of corruption into an airtight case. Robert Chen confirmed, Elliot announced, ending a call. He'll testify about the offshore accounts he managed between 88 and 92. That's our third whistleblower this week. Alexander nodded, studying a document. Robert always had a conscience. It's why they forced him into early retirement. He paused, frowning at the paper in his hands. But we still need something concrete linking the old guard to the current operations. Marianne looked up, dark circles under her eyes betraying her exhaustion. Like they linked you to their crimes. The bitterness had faded from her voice, replaced by determination. I've been thinking about that morning, Alexander said quietly. The morning I left. I keep wondering if there was another way. Don't, Marianne cut him off. We can't change the past, but we can damn well fix the future. Elliot's laptop chimed with an incoming email. His expression shifted from professional focus to shock as he read. They found it. The original server backup from 90. The one supposedly destroyed in the fire. The room erupted into action. Decades of buried transactions, emails, and internal memos flooded their screens. The evidence was damning. Board members coordinating with organized crime, judges accepting bribes, police commissioners looking the other way. Look at this, Elliot pointed to a particular document. Internal memo from Richard Harris to the board, dated 3 days before your disappearance, Mr. Reynolds. It explicitly details the threat against Mrs. Reynolds and there's more. What is it? Marianne moved to look over his shoulder. They had a backup plan. If you hadn't left, Mr. Reynolds, they were going to frame you for everything. Forged documents, falsified signatures, doctored photographs. They were going to make you the fall guy for the entire operation. Alexander sank into a chair, the full weight of the past crashing down on him. They would have destroyed both of us. My disappearance. It actually protected your reputation too, Marianne. They couldn't use me as a scapegoat if I was gone. Marianne's hand found his shoulder, squeezing gently. It was the first gesture of real forgiveness between them. We need to move fast, Elliot interjected, still typing furiously. Once we start exposing this, they'll try to bury it again. We need to release everything simultaneously, to the FBI, SEC, and media. Alexander stood, decision crystallizing in his mind. No. First, we confront them directly. Give them a chance to turn themselves in. That's too dangerous, Marianne protested. It's the right thing to do, he insisted. We need to be better than them. Besides, he added with a grim smile, I've arranged some insurance. His phone buzzed with a message. Teams in position. Surveillance confirmed on all targets, awaiting your signal. The boardroom at the Plaza Hotel thrummed with nervous energy. Alexander stood at the window, watching black SUVs arrive, disgorging men in expensive suits, the remaining architects of his past destruction, now aged but no less dangerous. They're all coming, Elliot confirmed, monitoring his tablet. Every single one still alive. Marianne adjusted the hidden camera disguised as a brooch on her blazer. Remember, we need clear confessions. The evidence is strong, but their lawyers will fight without direct admissions. Alexander turned from the window, taking in the scene. The mahogany table was set for 12, each place marked with a name card and a thick manila envelope. The contents would change everything. Mrs. Reynolds, the hotel manager appeared. They're ready. Marianne nodded, squeezing Alexander's hand before taking her position. They had agreed she would greet them first. The shock of seeing her would be unsettling enough, but Alexander's appearance would be the catalyst. James Harrison entered first, now in his 80s, but still carrying himself with the arrogance of old money. He froze at the sight of Marianne, color draining from his face. Welcome, James, she said smoothly. Please, take your seat. One by one, they filed in. Michael Mackenzie, Patricia Donovan, Elliot's aunt, William Foster, and 3 others. Each reacted similarly to Marianne's presence, their corporate masks slipping to reveal fear. What is the meaning of this? Harrison demanded, voice trembling. We were told this was about a potential merger. Oh, it's about much more than that, Marianne replied, steel wrapped in silk. It's about settling old debts. The door closed with a decisive click. Alexander stepped out from the adjoining room, and the effect was immediate. Patricia Donovan gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Impossible, Foster whispered. Quite possible, Alexander said, moving beside Marianne. Though I must admit, you all look terrible. Guilt ages people, doesn't it? If this is some kind of shakedown, Mackenzie began, half rising. Sit down, Michael, Elliot ordered, emerging from his corner. Patricia Donovan's eyes widened at the sight of him, her dead sister's son, the spitting image of a younger Alexander Reynolds. Inside those envelopes, Alexander continued, you'll find copies of everything. The original threats, the money laundering records, the offshore accounts, even the plans to frame me if I didn't disappear. He paused, letting the implications sink in. And documentation of every illegal transaction you've conducted in the 4 years since. Harrison's hand shook as he opened his envelope. These records were destroyed. Like my mother was destroyed. Elliot stepped forward, addressing his aunt directly. Like all the other accidents you arranged? Patricia Donovan crumpled in her chair, decades of secrets finally overwhelming her. Catherine knew too much, she whispered. She was going to expose everything. We had to. Keep talking, Patricia, Marianne said quietly. The FBI agents in the next room are very interested in what you have to say. The adjoining door opened. Federal agents filled the room, followed by SEC investigators. The next few minutes blurred into activity. Arrests, rights being read, attempted escapes thwarted by more agents in the hallway. Through it all, Alexander stood with Marianne, their hands clasped tightly together. They watched as their past tormentors were led away in handcuffs, their carefully constructed world of privilege and corruption crumbling around them. 1 year later. The evening reception buzzed with quiet conversation as Vancouver's art community gathered to celebrate the opening of a new exhibition. Shadows and Light, 3 decades of transformation. Marianne stood in the center of the main gallery, radiant in a deep blue evening dress, her silver hair elegantly styled. The exhibition was her masterpiece, a carefully curated collection telling their story through art, featuring works created during the 4 years of separation. Each piece reflected a moment in time: darkness, hope, longing, and finally, redemption. Alexander moved through the crowd to join her, looking distinguished in his charcoal suit, wedding band catching the light. They'd married again 6 months ago, a small ceremony on the beach with Elliot as best man. The Toronto Star's art critic just called it breathtaking, he murmured, sliding an arm around her waist, though I think she was more impressed by the story behind it. Speaking of stories, Marianne smiled, nodding toward where Elliot stood with Sarah, Marianne's former assistant. Their heads were bent close together, their body language suggesting more than professional interest. Life has a way of coming full circle, Alexander observed softly. The past year had seen tremendous changes. The federal investigation had led to dozens of arrests, the exposure of corruption networks across North America, and most importantly, justice for those who had been silenced, including Catherine Donovan. Marianne leaned into his embrace, watching guests move from piece to piece, following their journey through art. The final installation was a commissioned work, 2 paths converging after a long separation, painted in colors of gold and silver. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Not finding another way back then?" Alexander turned her to face him. "I regret every minute we lost," he said. "But I don't regret keeping you safe. And now—" He gestured to the gallery, to their friends and family gathered around them, to the life they were finally building together. "Now we have tomorrow." Elliot joined them, champagne glasses in hand. "To tomorrow," he proposed. "To family," Marianne added, including him in their embrace. The Vancouver lights twinkled beyond the gallery windows, and somewhere in the distance a new day was dawning. What did you think of Marianne's story? Please leave a comment with your opinion. 2 buttons will appear next to it, one to subscribe if you haven't already, and another to watch other exciting stories. Make your choice. Thanks for watching this far. See you soon.